Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming to this session. As I always say, the attendance, the participants are more important than the speakers. So thank you very much indeed. The first thing is I would like to thank Lisbon Addictions for putting us on the main stage, which has a lot of benefits, but also apparently some shortcomings because the room is very big and it may appear that it's empty, but there are enough number of people in there. I would like to thank Interglam for actually making this session possible. And I was quite pleased to note that there is a number of sessions related to drug markets in the conference. And by the way, today happened to be Thanksgiving Day for those coming from the States. Happy Thanksgiving Day. And thank you for being away from your families to be here with us. I am Roumen Sedefov. I'm responsible for this area at the EMCDDA, and I will chair this session. The title of the session is The Globalized Illicit Drug Market. So actually, why do we have this session in an addiction conference? And the very simple or maybe simplistic answer to that is that if there's no drug markets, there's no drug use, and there's no addiction to drugs. Maybe a bit too crude to say, but essentially I think that is true. The second thing is this whole addiction conference is about public health. And it's my deep belief that addressing markets is one of the main tools to address public health when it comes to drugs. So what are the main characteristics of the globalized drug markets? If I only have to use 4 words, I've chosen it's resilient, it's globalized, it is innovative, and it is increasingly digital. So those are kind of the main characteristics of the drug market. Resilience is actually something that's pretty obvious, and you will see in some of the presentations after a number of intentional enforcement. There's no disruption of drug markets. They continue to function, they're there, and unfortunately many of them are getting stronger. There is also unexpected disruptions, and the best example here would be COVID. And what we've seen is that COVID actually disrupted the drug market only partially, only temporarily, and only for some drugs. And another very, very recent example is the war in Ukraine. I've met a Ukrainian colleague the other day, and frankly, the market there is functioning. It has adapted, it's not the same, but it's functioning. So even the war could not disrupt the drug market. So resilience, this is probably the first thing when we speak about drug market. In the EMCDDA, we use a broad definition of drug markets, and that probably explains why I'm talking about public health. So our definition actually starts from production, going all the way through trafficking, to distribution, and to the users themselves. And users are the biggest group that participate in the drug market. And that's why it is important in events like this to speak about drug markets, because actually we are concerned about the users. Along the way, we are fighting organized crime, we are dealing with a number of processes, a number of actors that are in the drug market, but actually our main interest is to reduce the availability of drugs to users or to reduce the harms to users through all our interventions in the drug market. In Europe, at least, I am from the European Monitoring Center. I understand and know well the European market. Right now, we have a high availability of any kind of drugs right now, high potency, high purity drugs. And overall, the affordability of drugs, not necessarily the prices, but the affordability of drugs is actually higher than it used to be a decade ago. So there is issues with drug markets that needs to be dealt with, and there are issues that I would like to address during this session. As I said, innovation, globalization, major drivers, but we have always to remember there is one key driver to drug markets, and this is demand. If there is no demand, the drug drivers cannot be driven. And I think that is something that we always have to remember. The drug markets are internationally very well connected. There is a lot of competition, but there is also a lot of cooperation within the organized crime that is driving the drugs market. And maybe the last point is about the markets actually being digitally enabled. We just had a very, very good session on social media and drug dealing. Surface web, dark web, social media, mobile communications, both for users and for organized crime that is driving the market, very important and actually key driver. It's a very complex problem, and I don't want to take more time. What we've done is to try to break the complex problem into smaller pieces. And to do that in this session, we have four excellent speakers. Our first speaker would be Professor Peter Reuter. And Professor Reuter, I think you have already chaired and presented in many sessions, so I will not go into reading your resume. But just I would like to mention here that you established the RAND Corporation's Drugs Policy Research Center back 30 years ago, probably. And then you moved into academia, and you have done a lot of research into the policies in the United States and Western world related to drugs and drug markets. The title of your presentation is How Robust and Innovative is the Illegal Drug Markets? And I would like to invite you now to introduce us.
Thank you. So, good. Thank you for the introduction. This is not the reporting of a project, but rather effort to provide a sort of a framework for our discussion about drug markets generally. And I was asked to address sort of three questions. How has trafficking changed, international trafficking changed in the last 10 years? I won't be particularly restricted to 10 years. How robust is it? I was going to talk about how innovative, but that turned out to be a step too far. I have a view that they're not very innovative, but it's hard to document that. And then I was asked to deal with the question of how the markets have reacted to enforcement and whether the increasing number of countries that have failed states or civil war is likely to change patterns of trafficking. And my starting point is just some simple economics. We talk about demand and supply. It's a standard classification. A problem with the classification is that many interventions have both demand and supply effects. If you lock up retail drug dealers, you're also locking up some of the demand. If you treat frequent users of heroin, you are removing some of the supply as well. It's useful to keep in mind supply effects versus demand effects, but they're often difficult to pull apart. Drugs are mostly sold in markets. There are social networks, but not a very large share for most drugs. And we care about the prices. That is, if heroin was very cheap, we would have a different kind of problem than we have when heroin is very expensive. Higher dependence, but versus less crime. So understanding what determines prices and how markets operate is important for policy purposes. And economics is useful, I think, for studying this. Economists are less useful. They have a passion for good data, or at least many numbers. Not clear that they know what good data means in many cases. And our field is not good at supplying a lot of supply-side numbers, so they have not done a great deal, but I think the basic discipline is useful. Example of useful economic insights, coca, opium farmers, etc., actually turn out to not make much more money than their neighbors who are in legal crops. And explanation for an economist is fairly obvious. The buyers bid for the land and labor that's needed to produce what they want to sell in the down market, and they pay no more than they have to pay for that, and that is just some risk premium, and the risks are not very large in most countries, so the farmers earn somewhat more, but not much. A more unexpected insight come from a paper 30 years ago, which showed that if you crack down through interdiction on trafficking, let's say from Colombia on cocaine. Yes, I always walk away from that, sorry. That if you, more intense interdiction, seizing more cocaine has two effects. One is it raises the price of cocaine in the retail market, and that reduces consumption. On the other hand, it also increases the amount of cocaine that you have to send in order to get 1 ton of cocaine to the final market, let's say in the US. And it turns out, under most reasonable assumptions, the second effect is larger than the first. So the result of interdiction, more intense interdiction, can actually be an increase in the export demand from Colombia. And perhaps the most interesting insight is a paper by Steve Levitt and Sudhir Venkatesh, which appears in Levitt's Freakonomics volume under Why Do Drug Dealers Live with Their Mothers? And the answer is that they earn less than the minimum wage, roughly speaking, because in effect, and this is the Levitt model that's so interesting, because in effect they're buying a ticket in the lottery of becoming a senior drug dealer, in which case you will make a lot of money, and so they're willing to give their labor for a lot less than it might otherwise be worth. And so economics, sort of simple economics, can provide some really useful insights. But it's also important to remember that drug markets are embedded in economic and political developments generally. The mass markets, mass drug markets that emerged in the late 20th century come not because suddenly there's an interest in drugs, they come from a whole array of changes in society that are associated with becoming richer, sort of change in social, in values generally, and you see this also with other illegal markets also, but they reflect the changes in the larger society around them. So let me talk about recent changes in drug trafficking, and I will start actually with a diversion, which is, I'll say something about fentanyl. Here I am, oh dear, I don't know how that happened. Can someone come and rescue me? Oh, there we are, right. Here, there we are. Speaking on Thanksgiving, somehow it's an American day, so let me tell something about a problem that is uniquely North American. And it's not that fentanyl is a sort of a new drug for which there was suddenly a demand, which has been our typical case. When new drugs appear, there has been a demand for that drug, whether it be cocaine, methamphetamine, various kinds of NPS. This was a drug which was cheaper for the sellers and could be substituted for heroin. And what's interesting with respect to trafficking is that from 2014, when it first appeared in any substantial way in the US market, through 2019, it entered the US primarily in direct shipments from China, from quasi-legal or legal small producers of pharmaceuticals in China who would ship directly. It was wonderful to go on the web and say, I want to buy some fentanyl in 2018, and just get these great ads that say, we will ship it to your house within the next 2 weeks for a quite modest amount of money. Then in 2019, the Chinese government took action against fentanyl production, and the trafficking pattern changed dramatically. It now was that China was no longer exporting any substantial amount of fentanyl. It was it was shipping precursors to Mexico, where drug trafficking organizations that provided all the other illegal drugs then produced fentanyl. And what's strange, you would think that was to lead to a substantial break in the sort of curve of fentanyl problems in the US as suddenly this restriction took effect. Can't see any evidence of a break in that, which brings you to a concern that maybe we have less control of these markets than that our controls are weaker than we claim. The big puzzle about fentanyl is why it is only a North American problem. I'm originally Australian. Australia is wonderfully well connected to China. Tensions in the relationship, but nonetheless strong, large pipeline of commerce and traffic pre-COVID, and yet fentanyl is a very rare drug in Australia. Same Britain, you would also expect to have a large fentanyl market. No, it doesn't. And maybe one explanation is that British and Australian heroin dealers care more about the well-being of their customers. I find that not a particularly striking possibility. And so we're just left with this puzzle. Why has the cheap production of fentanyl only led to an effect, to a large market in the US? But let me get to the mainstream of my analysis. As Roumen suggested, globalization transforms drug trafficking. And I've just listed here some of the elements that go with that, and I won't go through them all, but for example, the increasing integration of national societies just through migration patterns where you have large immigrant groups from countries which are along trafficking routes or from production countries that make it much easier to traffic as compared to the 1960s or even 1970s. Though Roumen suggested that the internet has really made a change in trafficking, what's striking is the lack of any evidence that has become a large share of the market. And I'll put up here just some data from UNODC on the scale of the major dark markets for drugs, and these numbers should be put in the context of total sales of drugs that are in the hundreds of billions, and this is going to be barely single-digit billions at the high end. And again, a puzzle is as to why the internet is still such a small part of the trafficking world. So I think of drug trafficking as embedded in the sort of pipelines of commerce and traffic, legal commerce and traffic. And it's interesting that the US has a niche supplier for heroin. Afghanistan dominates the global market, but has almost no presence in the US. Instead, Mexico, which is a very high-cost supplier, if you compare the farm gate price of opium in Mexico to that in Afghanistan, Mexico is absurdly expensive. What it is cheaper at is smuggling, because there's this huge pipeline of commerce and traffic from Mexico to the US, and it was much expanded with the passage of the North American Free Trade Agreement. So that sort of really tightened the connection between Mexico and US with respect to heroin. But the aspect of the market I was going to spend some time on again to sort of illustrate how drug trafficking reflects changes outside of the drug world, so to speak, is to talk a bit about money laundering. This may actually be the only talk in this conference in which money laundering comes up, and it is now an important part of the international drug trade, and there are increasing variety of ways that money can be moved. But what is particularly interesting is the development of a new money laundering network associated with Chinese money laundering organizations. And they have emerged as a result of actions taken by the Chinese government that's created demand for getting money illegally out of China. So in 2017, Chinese government, I think rather out of the blue, imposed a limit of $50,000 on how much individual could ship out of China. And there's a very large, wealthy and upper middle class Chinese population that would like to move more of its assets to other countries. So now there's a demand for exporting money out of China, which money laundering organizations then match with the demands of drug traffickers in the US to get money from the US to Mexico, and you get this three-way trade. And what's interesting is that, for reasons that I can't yet explain, the primary costs are borne by the Chinese customers who are exporting their money, and that results in a very sharp decline in the money laundering costs faced by drug dealers moving their money from the US to Mexico. But in fact, saying a little bit about innovation, what's interesting is how little drug traffickers have been using the more sophisticated forms of money laundering. But let me talk about the response to interdiction. 5? No. So the conventional wisdom is that interdiction is sort of defeated by the balloon effect, the notion that you crack down here and then the traffic or the production moves somewhere else. And I mean, it's really, it's a relabeling of a very conventional economic proposition. The evidence for it is surprisingly weak. There's research about the effects of eradication that really has not picked up balloon effects, I think in large part because it is focused on the effects, on the local effects rather than the global effects. And there's been almost no empirical research about interdiction. I mean, the last decent study, empirical study as opposed to simulations and theoretical pieces, I think really is around 2000. And what makes this relevant is the global interdiction rate for heroin and cocaine seems to have increased quite substantially. And in defense of the proposition, there's no evidence of a large increase in the price. But I think what you need to do is think through how drug traffickers choose routes. And essentially they're trying to minimize the costs per kilo of smuggling, and the principal costs that they face are associated with various kinds of risks. For example, they have to pay pilots large sums in order to compensate them for the risk of getting arrested and imprisoned if they're caught in this dealing, etc. And bribes, the payment to corrupt officials, are an attempt to mitigate those risks and think about the marginal cost of bribing officials against the reduction in your shipping costs. It's a nice theoretical model, never been validated. But then the question is, how important is interdiction in terms of determining risk and cost? And you notice that there's a lot of transshipment. So here's a map, and I happen to love, I just think it looks so lovely. Even if it's not true, I want to keep that up on the board. But what it points to is the extent to which traffic is now through multiple countries. And that makes the important point that interdiction is probably very much related, I mean, the risks are related not simply to whether you cross a particular border, but where you cross it from. So coming from Colombia to the US is high risk. From Colombia to Chile to the US may be lower risk. So it may be that interdiction has very little consequence in terms of how routes flow. I mean, that's the notion of the balloon effect. However, it's not as though this is a very the market for corrupt officials is not a very well-functioning market. And there may be what are called intramarginal rents, so that even if you make it riskier to come through a particular country, you don't have to pay more to that corrupt official in order to, you can pay more to that corrupt official and still have the optimal route for doing that. So let me actually, so an example of a counterexample to the balloon effect is the crackdown in Mexico in recent years. The Mexican government has clearly raised the risks of trafficking cocaine through Mexico. There's a minor shift in activities, but Mexico remains the dominant cocaine entry point. What in fact has been the reaction to this? It has not been change in trafficking routes, it's been a change in trafficking structure. So that what was once a cartel-dominated industry is now a trafficking system in which there are many smaller players. And you see that again with the crackdown in Colombia on Cali. And let me finally say something about, and I'll just take 1 minute. There are an increasing number of countries with civil war and or failed governments. This is just one map showing the increase in the number of failed governments over the last, between 2006 2022. And you might say, well, that means, failed states provide effectively open borders, willing accomplices and corrupt officials. And you say, well, do you have to be a failed state to bribe a lot of that? And the answer is no. We have many countries where that already happens, and indeed failed states often provide a sort of unhelpful environment for traffickers who need sort of to build stable relationships with officials, which are difficult to do in unstable places. Drug trafficking services may serve as a destabilizing influence, but the rise of more failed states, I believe, has little consequence for drug trafficking. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Reuter. Maybe if you could stay there. I would like to take some questions, if there are any, please. I would be very happy if somebody challenges Professor Reuter. I can't see. Okay, maybe I challenge you. I do believe that innovation drives the current market. There are many examples of this. We're not going to go into semantics, what is innovation and what isn't, but when you look at the production processes of drugs, in the last literally few years, they have changed dramatically. The precursors that have been used, the chemicals that have been used, the processes that have been used to produce drugs actually allow for much larger quantities of drugs. And this is clearly something that has happened in the last few years. And this was driven to a big extent by the internet, which was another thing that you weren't quite sure about. Internet, it's not necessarily only seen as a marketplace. Marketplace is only one of the functions. Internet is a communication channel, it is a knowledge hub, and clearly looking into the digital technology only as kind of surface web and dark web is very limited.
So let me, I understand exactly what you're saying. To say that they're not innovative is not to say they're not adaptive. But the question is, they're very slow at this kind of thing. NPS, those are some new substances that come out of labs, very much lagging what is going on in chemistry generally. The use of the internet, I mean, internet was important 20 years ago, and it's only playing a modest role now. It's not that there's no change, it's just that these are markets which don't attract the most capable people. If you think back to the stories about organized crime as a phenomenon in the middle of the 20th century, the notion was that you had large populations, immigrant populations, that had little opportunity, in the legitimate economy, and so you had very capable people from poor backgrounds that sort of provided the talent for the mafia in the US and organized crime elsewhere. That's not a compelling story now. It is much easier for people from those kinds of backgrounds to get jobs in legitimate settings, get education and jobs in legitimate settings that pay well. The drug trafficking organizations, and this is why I sort of would say are led by people of who clearly have cunning, they're able to project authority and use violence, but they are not people with deep strategic sense, nor do they have access to professionals that provide that. So it's not that there's no change, it's just that I think that they're lags in that and they're not very innovative. So that's an extent.
Thank you. Is anybody from the audience would like to jump in right here? No. So we can say we are inconclusive on this point. Thank you, Professor Reuter. Much appreciated. You have set up the scene for our next speakers, and our next speaker is Professor Marieke Liem from the Security and Global Affairs Institute at Leiden University. She's an expert in interpersonal crime and violence. Europe is very concerned right now about the increase in violence, in particularly related to the drug market, in particularly when it comes to systematic violence. Some people will argue that this is not very big comparing to the size of the market. However, the social implications of this type of crime are very worrying at political level and for us at expert level. So I would like you to enlighten us. And the title of your presentation is, to what extent can drug violence indicate us there was something about underlying drug market activity? Thank you, Marieke.
Thank you very much, Roumen. And maybe to give you a spoiler alert, to some extent, yes. We believe that drug violence indicators or drug violence can be used to a certain extent as indicators of underlying drug market activity. And in the next 15 minutes or so, I'd like to show you some of the preliminary work that we've been doing in Europe. But maybe to provide you with some illustration of what drug violence actually looks like in Europe today, let me just talk you through some of the incidents that we've encountered in these last 2 years. For example, in Deurne, a village close to Antwerp, a hand grenade was detonated in January 2020 and was aimed at a man whose twin brother was active in the Antwerp drug war. Now, several months later, a body was found in Le Havre, a French town, of a dock worker who allegedly was involved in the international cocaine trade. In that very same month, for those of you who are from the Netherlands, you may be well acquainted with this case, it's several containers that the police were able to retrieve following an EncroChat hack, and these containers were equipped as so-called torture chambers, allegedly installed by a man named Roger P., who wanted to have his former accomplice in this chamber, forcing him to pay back the millions that he allegedly stole from him. Then, less than a year later, or a little over a year later, in Marseille, in summer of summer of 2021, almost 20 people were killed in a local drug war. Some were active in that drug war, but many were also involved as innocent bystanders. And then last year, in that same month, a journalist by the name of Peter R. de Vries from the Netherlands, who acted not only as a crime journalist, but was also acting as a confidant of the major Crown witness in a very large criminal trial, the Marengo case, featuring Ridwan Taghi, amongst others. He was shot and killed in Amsterdam. And then finally, as I was preparing this presentation, and I was looking at the headcounts in Sweden resulting from the ongoing drug war involving shootings there, was already accumulating to 50 in October this year. So this is just a brief illustration of what is going on in Europe today. And as a criminologist, I was asking myself and my colleagues with me, so what can we make of this, right? What does this tell us? And I think it tells us various things. One is that drug-related violence has many different faces, and it demonstrates, it shows in different facets and in different ways. One of the ways to conceptualize this, I believe, is to look at drug violence as an indicator of underlying drug market activity. However, we all know that drug violence, the majority of the drug violence takes place underwater, right? This is why I put an iceberg here in this picture. So the majority is hovering below water. It's invisible, right? What we do tend to see, however, are drug-related homicides when they occur. And the same can be said for hand grenades, increasingly so, particularly in Sweden, to some extent Belgium and the Netherlands, that are hovering somewhere below the waterline and above the waterline, because sometimes they are visible and they are retrieved by the police, but other times they remain invisible. And the same accounts for shootings taking place in this context. So this is why, by lack of any other good indicator or solid indicator, we tend to use drug-related homicide as an indicator of drug violence. And in doing so, we hope to say a little bit more about the underlying drug market activity that is taking place. So let us take a closer look at this indicator, drug-related homicide. Now, for those of you who are studying this field, you're maybe quite familiar with this trifecta, this tripartite framework in which we distinguish three main types. The first one being psychopharmacological, so violence resulting from the direct intake of specific types of drugs. The second one, economic compulsive, so crimes being committed in order to sustain a drug habit. But the third one, and that's the one that we'll be focusing on today particularly, is the systemic one, so violence taking place in the context of drug market activity. So let us take a closer look at some of the pilot data that we collected throughout Europe with our European partners in the Netherlands, Sweden, Finland, France, and Switzerland. But let us start off by the Netherlands. And this is to indicate the average total number of drug-related homicides that take place in a year. And in the Netherlands, it's about 40. But what we find is if we zoom in on these drug-related homicides, is that about 2/3 of these cases are systemically related. That is to say, that are related to organized crime in the context of the drug market, more so than psychopharmacological or systemic. Now, and Peter Reuter has just shown this in his presentation, showing some maps of some global maps of global trading routes. And there you already saw the Netherlands being this hub, this entry point, if you will, for large quantities of cocaine. Now, and this may be the relatively high share of systemic drug-related homicides may thus be very well a reflection of the Netherlands being such an entry point. Now, if we move up in Europe, so for example, when we look at Sweden, also see a substantial number, about 1/3 of all drug-related homicides being systemically related. But if we move even further north, you may want to say towards the end point rather than through transit countries. For example, in Finland, the share has diminished to about 13%. In other words, what seems to occur is that as we move up the European corridor, or down the corridor, you may say, from the entry point all the way to the end of the corridor, it seems to be that not only the share of systemic drug-related homicide seems to decrease, but it also seems to change, right? What we find in the Netherlands, what I just illustrated by showing you the example of Peter R. de Vries being killed, shot and killed in Amsterdam, but also these torture chambers, is that these conflicts have a highly international character, right? They're not about fights over 50 grams of stolen drugs. No, they're about millions of euros and tons of cocaine being seized or being missing or being stolen. And as we move down the corridor, it seems to take place more in a local level, for example, in the context of Sweden. A similar dynamic seems to occur when we move down the corridor. So again, we have this northern corridor, so it seems in a southern corridor, where also, for example, in the context of Marseille, we see very much a local conflict taking place, also in the context of drug-related violence, but not necessarily the international character that it has at the entry point. And in other countries, such as in Switzerland, we find even a smaller share, not only of the systemic drug-related homicides, but drug-related homicides overall, which also tells us something interesting, because we know that the market there is quite active, and recent EMCDDA analyses, wastewater analyses, have shown that St. Gallen and Zurich alone have substantial residues of cocaine in their wastewater, but still we do not see that reflected in drug-related violence in this country. So how can we explain this, right? Well, again, I feel that one of the ways in which we can interpret, or one of the ways in which we can explain this high degree of systemic drug-related homicide in the Netherlands is its very nature as a transit country, right? We do not only have the large port of Rotterdam, but also vast amounts of drugs that are taken from the Antwerp harbor, are first transported into the Netherlands and then transited to other European countries. So is it really a reflection of the Netherlands as a country? I think it's more a reflection of the location and the fact that it's an international meet and greet place, both for legal trade, but also for illegal trade. Now, let us take a closer look at the sort of temporal development over time, linking to what Roumen just pointed out, looking at the fact, or looking at to what extent is drug-related violence, to what extent is it resilient over time. Now again, if you look at the Netherlands, the vast majority of drug-related homicide is indeed of systemic character. Now, as the graph in here illustrates, it fluctuates quite a bit over time, but in that fluctuation, there's a comparative stability. And this becomes even clearer if we contrast it to the overall homicide rate. Now, we know from also from other European countries is that the homicide rate tends to decline, and it declines quite dramatically, also in the Netherlands, but also in other Western European countries. However, whatever pushes down that general homicide rate does not seem to impact drug-related homicide to a similar extent. And as you can see in this graph, I've mapped drug-related homicide here, but also criminal milieu homicides, which are closely operationalized in a fairly similar way, and hence we can go back even further in time, and there the contrast becomes even more apparent, where you see again the general homicide rate going down, but there's a remarked resilience. Roumen, you just used that term. Remarked resilience of drug-related homicide over time. Now, shifting our focus a bit from the temporal level to the spatial level, if you remember the iceberg that I showed you all the way in the beginning, looking at the indicators, right? Homicide at the top and hand grenades and shootings somewhere in the middle. Now, if we map drug-related homicide in the Netherlands, the following picture emerges. And maybe what strikes you, or at least what struck me, is that it's heavily located around the major cities. That is to say, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, The Hague. So these are also the most pronounced international meeting places. And to a lesser extent, we find drug-related homicides taking place along the southern border with Belgium. And this doesn't seem to be so much cocaine trade related, but rather to a limited extent to the amphetamine production, but to a much less strong than the cocaine trade. Now, so if we take homicide and we map that, or at least we try to plot the shootings, so the non-lethal shootings, a remarkably similar picture emerges, also with shootings primarily taking place in these major cities and along the Belgian border. And then finally, then the hand grenades also show a fairly similar pattern. Now, at this point, it becomes largely anecdotal, right? Because many of the drug-related homicides can be solved, but there's also quite a fair share that's not being solved. And for shootings and hand grenades, these usually remain unsolved, particularly when we look at the hand grenades. However, if we are to look at the spatial distribution, and we know that drug-related homicides are have such a systemic nature to them, what we might infer from this, and again, this is at this point speculation, but what we might infer from this is that these shootings and these hand grenades also have a systemic component to them. All right. Now, what can we conclude from all this? I think three things, and it also raises two questions. But I think what we can conclude from this is that, yes, to a certain extent, we can use violent incidents as indicators of underlying drug market activity. Also, because these indicators, particularly homicide, is a solid indicator, we can use it to conduct analyses over time, but also cross-culturally and cross-nationally. And then also what we can conclude is that in spite of vast changes in the overall homicide rate, what we still find is resilience when it comes to drug-related violence. Now, I also believe that these findings raise some important questions, because how can we explain such international variations? How can we explain that even though we know that in some areas there's high levels of drug market activity, there's not necessarily the associated violence that we may expect? And also, and this is just a hypothesis, but are we moving from a global level to a local level? In other words, to what extent are homicides at the entry point mostly international, and as it trickles down, they become more local and more national? So I think these are important questions to raise still, and I welcome any questions that you may have on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. May I invite you to challenge the speaker? I am aware that this was very much Europe-focused. If we extend it to the world, I think the picture probably will be.
Yes, and I think, and maybe to react to that, Roumen, I think much of our understanding today, many of the frameworks that we use to understand drug-related violence globally is taken from from much of the work that's being done in Latin America, much of the work that's being done in the United States. And I feel that the data that we have for Europe, at least the pilot data, they show a vastly different picture. So are these frameworks that we know from international scholarly research, are they necessarily fit to explain the current situation in Europe?
I'm sure somebody has an opinion on that. Sorry, I see one who is from the EMCDDA, so you have to wait, sorry. I would like to give the floor to MJ Menendez from the United States.
May I ask you to define drug-related homicide and to define systemic violence related to drugs? Yes.
We operationalize drug-related homicides as in lethal violence occurring between two people without the consent of one of these persons. This is important because it excludes euthanasia, and it also excludes suicide. So we operationalize homicide using the UNODC definition, and we operationalize drug-related as in any form in which the homicide had a drug component to it. So that being psychopharmacological, as in if the person, either the victim or the perpetrator, or both, had ingested drugs prior to or at the moment of the event. Economic compulsive, if there was, for example, a robbery in which a drug addiction played a role, for example, a heroin person addicted to heroin, robbing a store, killing someone in the meantime, but was robbing the store in order to sustain a drug habit. And then the systemic variant we operationalized as violence taking place within the context of a drug market, in the context of organized crime, but not necessarily related to the pharmacological or the economic compulsive subfactor. Yeah.
I think we have one more question lined up there. Would you like to speak next to the microphone? No?
Me? Hello? Hello?
Yeah, please, go ahead.
Hi. It's a bit of an inflammatory question, I guess.
Very welcome.
I'm a lowly doctor, and to the best of my knowledge, the CEO of Budweiser has never organised a hit I'm the CEO of Heineken. Why are we not talking about legalisation of the production, the distribution and the sale with taxation of these substances? Why is that not part of the conversation?
I think it can be a part of the conversation. I think it is, in fact, a part of the conversation in many European countries to date. However, one may question to what extent the legalization of this particular types of drugs would erase the entire problem that we're facing today. I agree, it is an important point, and I'm not a policymaker, as you will know, just a humble academic looking at the data and trying to make sense of what we're seeing. But it's a valid point indeed. Yes, thank you.
As you said, it's inflammatory, so we probably have to extinguish the fire for a while. There's one more, please. I'm sorry, Roland. Are you going to ask a question, please? Short, yes. Very short, please, and to the point.
Yes, thank you. Did you include violence that enacted by law enforcement or more concerningly by state actors? Because I think in a more global context outside Europe, I know studied on the Philippines, drugs on war and extrajudicial killings, and how translatable does this indicator concept to places where the policy is the one who act violence to people?
Yes, this is a very good point indeed, and I'm happy to talk to you after the presentation. Answer is no, such homicides are not included. We feel that it's less of a problem in Western Europe because the counts of police-perpetrated killings is fairly low compared to other global settings. And I agree with you, yes, such as in the Philippines or what we see in Brazil, this may represent a serious undercount. Yep.
Can I quickly just, have you used nationality as a parameter in your researches?
Yes, we do. Yeah. So this is also what we find in the Netherlands. So the vast majority of drug-related homicides that are committed there, we have indeed the nationality of both perpetrator and victim. Yeah.
Please make yourself available to more questions after the session.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
We have to move. We do have yet more exciting speakers, and the next one is our third panelist is David Mansfield. David has been conducting research on illicit economies in Afghanistan since 1997. He's probably the person that knows most about it. He has written a book, A State Built on Sand, How Opium Undermined Afghanistan, and he has produced, I think, close to 100 products that are based on research products that are based on observation and imagery, satellite imaging. David, you're a great friend of the EMCDDA.
Oh, that's very kind of you. Thank you very much. Yeah, I've been doing this for 26 years in Afghanistan, of doing work in Afghanistan. I know I don't look that old, but one of the things I thought would be quite useful to show is give you an idea of what Afghanistan actually looks like, what production looks like, because there's a lot of perceptions about Afghanistan. Hence my little colon subtitle, Dynamism Amidst Tradition, because there's this sense that Afghanistan has remained unchanged, farming has remained unchanged for hundreds of years, and the reality is the shifts have been enormous, particularly over the last 20 years, and I wanted to try and capture this with some of our method, but also with a very visual presentation. I recognize I'm on my time. Roumen's got me on the clock. I'm going to be flagged here, so I'm going to crack on. In terms of just saying that what I view as data, how we view data, is not just all the household interviews that we do. I have probably been involved in the best part of over 18,000 now, over 25 years, 26 years. But the other thing that we do is a lot of is GPS photos, high-resolution imagery, GIS analysis, and we're looking for the physical, the visual signatures of physical change. So we're not just working on an interview here, an interview there, or a lot of interviews here, a lot of interviews there. We're looking at how we understand how does change manifest, and how do we then use high-resolution imagery or much broader level GIS to actually assess that, quantify it. So I'll crack on. A few pictures. This is, Peter will no doubt disagree, others might. I'd argue there's a degree of innovation going on here because That's crystal meth that they're now producing in quite large amounts. In fact, I would say there's more than the amount of heroin that they produce in Afghanistan now. So there is some degree of change that's taking place, and we'll capture it in this. So first, talk about method, then adaptation, innovation. We can discuss the semantics of innovation in response to a number of things. Some of the things Peter raised, conflict. I'd also go on to the environment side, then enforcement. Look at practical examples of how people adapt and innovate in response to these different features, and then I'll just push on in the conclusion, and again, some interesting overlap with what Peter was saying. So, our method, as I mentioned, we are playing with GPS photos, that's Poppy. We're also, high-resolution imagery gives us the capacity to count things. It's great, it's a whole new toy. You can end up down all sorts of rabbit holes with this. We can tell the difference between a fuel container, a fuel truck, and a normal sort of a 40-foot container. We can also tell the difference, if you get the imagery at the right time, between poppy, wheat, and other crops. So, and we can monitor that change over time. So this is part of the method. We map and cost the different value chains. I think there's far too little done around costing production. We often hear about large profits, but if you haven't costed it, how do you know it's a profit? If you actually haven't worked out how much xylene do you need, how much diesel are you using, how much red phosphorus, what is the cost, what's my transport cost, what's my rent, what's my tax, if you haven't worked that out, how do you know what the profits are? And so we've been doing a lot of work on that, and not just on drugs. This was on meth, mapping that. We also did it in relation, we're also working on other value chains, chromite exports. A lot of that was being smuggled out of Afghanistan. It wasn't legally being produced and been moving across the border into Pakistan. Looked at coal, talc, a variety of different things. So the other thing is we're actually, as I mentioned earlier, we're looking at physical change. So this is the Pakistani border fence. Is it actually complete or not? We can actually look at the sequencing of how that fence has been built and how that changes the trade in different commodities, how it changes the costs of the movement of those commodities. And that's similarly a bit of stuff on, and that's an ephedrine lab, and we'll get onto that a bit later. So, adaptation, innovation, conflict, environmental change, and enforcement. So, first one, conflict. So I just want to give you a sort of idea, and it again touches on this point being made, how drug trafficking routes have adapted in response to the conflict that took place. So this is a sort of simplistic sort of model around movement from a place like Shahzad over here out into Pakistan. So if I move a kilo of opium from here, in 2014, I used to move it to this bazaar here, Shadal, and then I move across the border in these different routes. You can see all that purple there. That's actually poppy density mapping. Again, it's a GIS technique. So that was our route in 2014. Come into 2017, completely changes. I don't know if you remember, but in 2015, ISIS moved into this area. Subsequently, in 2017, the Americans dropped the mother of all bombs in this area. The conflict, as Peter was mentioning, drug traders don't like conflict. The conflict was so extreme, and they pushed people out of these areas so there was no one to grow poppy. Look at the poppy density compared to the previous year. Just drops. Subsequently, this bazaar becomes the main entrepot for drug trading. You now have to move your drugs to Marco. Again, you're taking the back route, donkey, by truck, by some degrees of cars, but you're backpacking, and then you're coming across the border here and here, right? And the price has just gone up of making that movement. It's gone up from about $3 when I used to move from here to here. It's now costing me $13 to do that two-legged journey. So the conflict has fundamentally changed the way I'm moving my drugs. As I say, that's the GIS that shows that the poppy densities drop because ISIS is there, the fighting's there, you can't grow drugs there, they've banned it, but also not a good place to hang around and trade. The other thing you should notice, the red, that's the Pakistani fence coming in, starts to come in. And also a nice little Taliban checkpoint to collect some 50 cents per kilo, not a lot. By 2022, this is what's happening at the moment, now you can just now we have one government. We can just move our drugs along the road to Marco, still take them through this route and out through Dubai. We now have a canalized trade system. So along the road, it's easier to move. It's starting to change a little bit with the Taliban's efforts now, but it's coming down here and then being backpacked over the border here. Now look at the fence, pushing the trade through. So it costs a lot more to move this route now. There's fewer competition, fewer people involved in the competition on the other side of the border. So, and there's the nice Taliban checkpoint, and the tax has gone up. So, next issue around change, innovation, adaptation. The environment. There's been a lot of change in Afghanistan. A lot of change on the agricultural, the amount of land under agriculture. And that is a consequence of Afghanistan's greater integration into the global system, the availability of particular kinds of goods, technology, etc. And I'm going to focus on the movement into the desert area. So this area, you'll see, used to be just desert across here. Now, from an imagery perspective, we can not only see that more land is on. So this is the main canal, and this was desert land. In 2003, there was 800 hectares of land in that area under cultivation. By 2021, there's 70,000 hectares. Not only is there more land under agriculture, but as a consequence of the imagery analysis, you can actually see that the vegetative index is greatly improved. In fact, there's been climatic change in these areas. The temperatures have started to equalize out. The desert used to be warmer than the canal-irrigated areas. They're now similar. The harvest used to be at different points. The harvest here was typically 10 days after the harvest here. They're now at similar points. So we've got these big changes taking place. Okay, what's at the root of that? All right, that's how it used to happen. Nice little bit of imagery game there. And what we started with, when people first started moving in the 2002, 2003, they sink a deep well, they put in a diesel generator, and they pump the water up from the ground, yeah? Starts like this, just the odd piece of land under poppy, plus a bit of wheat. Ends up like this, where you've just got field after field after field next to each other, none of the gaps. That is the canal-irrigated area. This is the canal. Here, that's the canal-irrigated area. That's the desert. Tell the difference. Different land settlements, different procedures around who can own land, who can rent land, etc. But nevertheless, from an agricultural point of view, these places have equalized. Then you look at it in relation to the role that poppy played in that expansion. That's 2021. Again, that's the same canal. The pink is poppy, 2021, 2022. So yes, there's a bit more poppy going on at the moment. I've still only 5 minutes. Wow, I better crack on. This is how it happened. First of all, put in the reservoirs. We started thinking people were doing, why have they got so many swimming pools? Then we realized that this was solar panel tube wells. So, that's the technology. Don't fancy getting the stuff off the top of that one in Lashkargah. 3 meter by 1 meter panels. Solar power just takes off. 2014. You can see how much you can irrigate. Farms of 9 hectares. And before you know it, we're up at, starting from just 182 of these solar panel tube wells in 2014, got 67,000 in 2019. We're just doing the count on 21, 2022. It's gone berserk. Reduce your costs. Not running the diesel's all got crap in it. It breaks the generator, etc., etc. So, okay, if you're going to cultivate that much land with poppy, you need a favor. You need to use some herbicides and some pesticides. Those are the ones on sale. And look, after a period of time, they even start marketing it for poppy. Comes from China. Boxes are also made in China, presented as for poppy. Questionable whether it's the right stuff or not. It has an effect in terms of these pesticides, but nevertheless. Okay, enforcement, meth industry, and then the Taliban version 2. There's a lot of crystal meth being produced in Afghanistan. So, We seem to have gone a bit too far. There we go. So, Alex Soderholm did some great work a few years ago, telling us how much the Iranians had squeezed production in Iran. What happened is it moved into Afghanistan. There was some training that took place, some skills building, transfer of knowledge. What was taking place initially was the use of OTC, over-the-counter medicines. Before you knew it, they were using ephedra. Grows wild in the mountains, cracking, nice and cheap. This is it drying, cut, and before you know it, you start to see this stuff accumulate because it's pretty much legal. There's no prohibition. This is a major bazaar in Abdul Wadud in Farah. Look, it starts to grow. You see that's the ephedra amassing. We knew it was amassing because we had ground photos of it. We could also see the other things. This is the residue that you'll start to see around labs, the milling, the red phosphorus. All these pictures are from the other week in Afghanistan. And so you start to see labs appear, ephedrine labs. We start to see visual signatures of those. And before you know it, we've counted 458 labs in this southwest zone alone. We're estimating they could produce 1,000 metric tons of crystal meth. And just to give it some idea, that's what it's looking like as a trade. But on this particular day, on 27th of November, this bazaar had 11,886 cubic meters of ephedra in it. That was enough to make 220 metric tons of crystal meth on that one day, if you convert that. So this was just streaming into this zone. 3-meter high piles, you can do some nice bit of work on that. We see this escalation of the size of these labs. Start to become quite large scale. Right, okay, now what are we looking at? Bit of poppy eradication you hear in the press, but that's nothing much going on. You can even see them eradicating a spring crop next to a larger fall crop just to compensate people. But this is what we've seen. Abdul Wadud has gone from having all of that volume of ephedra to nothing. It's completely gone, absent, finished. We're looking at the square meterage of this. You can actually see between March and September, just zeroes out. The labs start to close. That's a lab in 2022, gone 9 months later. So, another one. But what we've realized is this is so much bigger than we'd actually anticipated. We were looking at one corner, it's dispersed, but it was already, in terms of the balloon effect, there was a dispersal, but there was already a coexistence of other areas that were producing. We're just only scratching the surface on this. What we've seen subsequently is meth prices go through the roof, reaching up as much as $600 the other week, according to my broker. But what it's also affecting is opium prices. Opium prices are the highest they've been since 2003. They're up at $470 a kilo, which is, of course, affecting the price of morphine base, heroin base, and heroin hydrochloride. All gone through the roof as well. 3 times the price for a kilo of morphine base. I'm starting to work out the net returns on this. I've already done it for meth. I'm just concluding. Okay. Adaptation and innovation is a response to a wide range of often coincident factors. No one single thing. This is people are constantly evolving and changing. These illicit chains in Afghanistan employ large swathes of people. Meth, less than opium, but nevertheless, these are significant value chains with lots of nodal points where money is taken, where people are employed, rents are taken, etc. And as a consequence of that, profit margins are much lower than people say. Touches on some of what Peter was saying. And therefore, understanding costs matters. We flagged these a few years ago. The fact that the Taliban couldn't take 10% of the value in tax of meth or heroin, because if you did that, you'd actually be making a loss on those 2 products. So costs matter. We need to spend a lot more time working out costs so we better understand the penetration, the points of where we can intervene with more cost effectiveness. And I would say, as a consequence of all these things, innovation is essential in this rapidly changing environment. These catapults, all of this kind of thing, makes a difference at the margins because it's saving on costs. And that is the picture in terms of what we see is the real money is in securing volume, i.e. I can move multiple kilo loads through an area, and I've actually got absolute surety of passing it through that area. I cannot cope with the risks of getting caught in many of these markets. I'll leave it at that. Thank you. Sorry about that. Sorry for overrunning Tuesday.
David, it was very difficult to interrupt you. Fascinating. I don't say this about many presentations, but it's really fascinating. I'll have one question, if possible. Feel free to talk to David. I think he has so much to offer. Is there anybody from the audience fascinated as I am? Okay, let me ask you one question. You wrote recently a piece that's titled, "Will They, Won't They?" Can you answer in one sentence? I mean here about Taliban, and it's already called it in the name, ban. So would the Taliban ban it, or would they not ban it? So will they, won't they? What is your answer to that?
At this point, they've clearly moved against the ephedrine and methamphetamine crop. We see it. We see it with the prices. We are 3 weeks away from the end of the opium planting season, and many people are refraining and waiting to see if the Taliban's resolve will weaken. So a lot of people haven't planted. They've planted some wheat, and they're waiting to see. Prices tell us there's a perception that there's going to be a shortage.
Great, David. Much appreciated. We have to move to the next speaker. It's the last one. We're just about on time. Our next speaker is Tuesday Reitano. He's the Deputy Director of Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. Tuesday, I won't read all the degrees and titles you have. There are many. I think many people should know you by now. The title of your presentation is The Geography of Drug Markets and Hotspots of Violence. So kind of links to the previous two, links to geography and also to violence. And you will look into the broader geography of drugs markets and flows and how they set their paths across the globe and source countries to destination countries. Although I've been always thinking that lately source and destination countries kind of been blurred and we don't have this division. But okay, happen to listen to your presentation. Go ahead, please.
Thank you so much. As said, I'm Tuesday Reitano, the Deputy Director of the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. And I'm hoping very much to pick up where my colleagues on the panel left off. Our first slide, which doesn't want to change at all, takes a snapshot that I know you won't be able to read from a report that we issued last year, which was looking at the state of the globalised economy. What it describes in it, in all those little boxes, is the astonishing growth of 4 drug markets. As you heard in David's presentation, the poppy cultivation for opium and heroin has been soaring for years, and this year's opium crop in Afghanistan, which makes 85% of the world's production of heroin and opium, is the largest and most profitable that we've seen so far. As David described, the introduction of mass marketing of highly addictive opioid pharmaceuticals, which grew in the US in the late 1990s, have created a health epidemic, which in turn has given rise to a heroin and fentanyl crisis enabled by Latin American groups. After a brief decline in cocaine production between 2006 and 2013, production of cocaine is also at a record high, estimated at nearly 2,000 tons in 2017, and with no indication that it slowed in any meaningful way during the pandemic. New psychoactive substances have proliferated. Meanwhile, cannabis, herb, and resin continue to be produced and traded with ease, both legally and illegally. What we've basically seen, and as all of my colleagues on the panel have described, is that modes of production have gone global. There's been a shift to synthetic substances over the last 20 years, which has decreased dependence on proximity to crop cultivation, created new markets, and enabled new groups. Globally, the illicit drug trade has generated huge amounts of money and influence, both of which can destabilize existing political conditions, economic development, state security, and public safety. It has also, as Marieke showed us in her presentation, been closely linked to levels of violence in different places and in those where we wouldn't necessarily have expected it. So the key question that I wanted to discuss in my presentation is what actually shapes the geography of global drug markets? Why do they move through the routes they've taken? And what is their relationship to conflict and instability? For those of you who don't know, the Global Initiative Against Transorganized Crime is a civil society network dedicated to the fight against the illicit economy and mitigating its impact on the most vulnerable of people, on the environment, on businesses and states. We have over 100 staff organized into regional observatories, 6 of them, and a number of national observatories in countries where the illicit economy is very prevalent. And they work through series of local networks to get a very granular picture of the political economy of illicit markets around the world. One of our flagship products launched in 2021 was an organized crime index, which for the first time ranked 193 countries in the world according to their criminality and to their resilience to organized crime. And one of the key findings of our index was that there's an incredibly strong correlation between criminality and conflict. The less peaceful a country, the more likely it is to be afflicted by high levels of organized crime. From nearly 2 decades of granular research, both mine and those of my colleagues, what we have found is that conflicts have a particular influence on the illicit economy, often rupturing existing arrangements and accelerating illicit market development and empowering criminal actors. As David's presentation showed you very clearly, a change in the strategic environment can cause upheavals that have an impact on criminal markets and their actors, that episodes of conflict and insecurity cause criminal groups and particularly local territorially based mafias to grow, but they also cause displacement of people, both people in the legitimate economy and those in the illicit economy, which can often encourage criminality to move. Criminal groups seek new markets, as do states, to fund the continuation of conflict, and when sanctions are applied, those often make a conflict country seek external actors to circumvent those economic controls and make them highly dependent on external illicit assistance, which creates new transnational connections. A proliferation of arms in a conflict and the spillover to neighbors creates the foundation of a reservoir of violence-hardened armed groups who then become the foot soldiers of the illicit economy as it grows. And weak governance and instability in conflict and post-conflict states allows space for foreign criminal groups to take root. But this relationship isn't as linear and straightforward in its causality as it might seem at first. And so I've drawn from 3 very quick case studies to try and describe how that relationship exists and what you can expect a conflict to do to the patterns of illicit economy movement. First one, looking at the Western Balkans. When we looked at contemporary organized crime threats in Europe and the picture that Marieke so effectively described, it is actually the rise of Balkan criminal groups that's one of the headline stories to tell, and very much a driver of the increasing levels of violence. Criminal groups from the Western Balkans have been seen to be playing a strategic role in everything from cocaine trafficking to contract killing to the smuggling of migrants across the English Channel. In a recent report that we just published, we tracked how it was that the Balkan groups have been able to so effectively establish such potent criminal networks overseas. And much of it came back to the result of conditions triggered by war and instability in the Western Balkans in the 1990s following the fall of the Soviet Union. Basically, in a decade of conflict and independence struggles, violence, emerging states, and ending with the Kosovo war in the end of the late 1990s, the breeding ground for organized crime was created. In Serbia and Albania, often the criminals who made up the national war effort, both externally in the neighboring countries but also domestically, were local battalions made up of criminal groups who, and I quote from a Wall Street Journal article of the time, wrapped their criminal activities in the national flag. They washed their reputations while strengthening local control. They used their local positions, their leverage, and their arms to monopolize local war economies, and then in the post-conflict phase, took their newly cleaned reputations as patriots and used it to buy positions into the state. As sanctions and an international embargo were imposed between 1992 and 1996, that created a need for an active black market covering everything from food to fuel, arms, and ammunitions. In order to prevent social unrest due to prolonged shortages, the state had to sanction and protect smugglers to keep necessary goods flowing. Slobodan Milosevic's government went so far as to merge law enforcement agencies and security services with organized criminals, not only to create productive relationships, but also to supervise the extensive black and gray economies that were underpinning local need. Smuggling was both in the interests of the state and in some cases run by the state. The Serbian State Security Service has been clearly documented as having been funded, at least in part, by money earned from the sale of illicit goods, including drugs, that were seized by the customs agency. The war in Kosovo at the very end of the 90s created a humanitarian tragedy and political upheaval, but it also created an environment for organized crime. Because Kosovo was and still is an unrecognized state entity, during the war it needed assistance from abroad in order to survive. As a result, in addition to political and financial support, including from diaspora Kosovos overseas, several criminal activities emerged and embedded, such as the smuggling of arms, oil, drugs, and stolen cars, as well as extensive corruption to protect them. Into this post-conflict context of state building, weak institutions, and poor infrastructure, powerful individuals who'd participated in the war and had strong connections with the diaspora enhanced their wealth and influence by drifting between legal and criminal activities. After elections in 1990, however, in the late 1990s, however, the situation in Albania stabilized a lot, and a number of the Balkan countries who were targeting EU accession began to formalize their state institutions and target organized crime. As the governments started to crack down on drug groups and criminal actors, they began to displace. We saw in the early 2000s an extraordinary wave of emigration. So by the year 2000, a large number of Albanians were involved in illegal activities, had already left the country and established illicit enterprises abroad, particularly in Greece, Italy, Switzerland, and Germany. 10,600 Albanians emigrated to Apulia in Italy in 3 months of 1997 alone. So that gives you a sense of the scale that was being built up. By 2001, Albanian-speaking groups, including then groups from Kosovo and North Macedonia, were actively engaged in the heroin economy in several European countries. And by 2005, they'd gone further down Marieke's pipeline to begin trafficking heroin in the Nordic countries, mainly in Sweden. Their usual route into the drug economy was to purchase heroin from Turkish organizations and transport it into Western Europe, particularly via Hungary at the early days. They then sold them on the street for more reasonable prices than domestic crime groups and captured progressively market share. Of course, they had to deal with local competition from locally based criminal organizations, but here they did it by essentially selling their services as violence providers. Because the Albanian and Balkan criminal groups were more comfortable, more practiced with higher levels of violence, they offered their security services to the state and played an effective middleman role between production countries and destination criminal markets and built alliances which continued to grow. As Albania in particular has now become a source country for cannabis and synthetics, this has very much increased their power in regional drug markets. I'd like to draw now into a parallel of a contemporary conflict. We have an civil society observatory of organized crime recently started up in the Ukraine, monitoring the changes to the illicit economy in this nascent conflict that's only 250 days old. What I think it's worth predicating this on is the conflict involves two countries with the highest score in our organized crime index for the European countries, Ukraine and Russia. So there was a predicate baseline of criminality before the conflict began. The closure of the eastern border, obviously the conflict line, and the closure of Odessa port and the littoral coast closed down what was the strongest avenue for heroin trafficking and drug trafficking and other forms of illicit trade into and out of the Ukraine along the Balkan route. What that did is essentially hem the criminal groups in. And so while drug trafficking has continued to a certain extent, broadly criminal groups and actors have looked elsewhere. Many have turned to domestic activities and localized war economies. From what we see from our accounts on the ground, predation on humanitarian aid is considerable, with massive black markets developing around those criminal economies. And as in the Balkans, we're seeing a rise in the patriotic criminal, with criminals fighting on the front lines, but also funding the war effort. Drug trafficking and use is also on the rise in conflict-riven Ukraine, but the patterns are shifting. Satellite imagery has shown us that the known and likely methamphetamine labs are producing 24/7, day and night. Our researchers, while they were in the ground, encountered soldiers high on some kind of drug-based stimulant at the checkpoints in the east of the country, and there's evidence of NPS substances being used as a party drug in the clubs of Kiev, which continue despite the conflict. I think we have many reasons to fear similar outcomes to the Balkan wars from the Ukraine, given the huge scale of displacement that we've seen from the conflict. And we can further anticipate that any post-conflict scenario is likely to include huge inflows of cash into the country for reconstruction, which will be a boon to criminal and corrupt actors to capitalize on. But more than that, I think, Russian and Ukrainian organized crime groups used to work together prior to the conflict. While this seems to have stopped currently with the rise of patriotism, as the conflict ends and the almost certain isolation of Russia politically and economically continues, state-controlled criminal means are likely to be used to evade sanctions and cause retributive harm against the West. And of course, as the immediacy of the conflict recedes and business as usual returns, but with more arms, more people accustomed to violence, potentially suffering the mental health impacts of the conflict and struggling to find their legitimate livelihoods under a damaged socio-economic fabric, this promises to be the breeding ground for an acceleration of crime. I'm going to slip our slide on West Africa in the interest of time, but I'm happy to talk about it to anybody afterwards. And I wanted to take this slide last. We talk a lot about conflict and instability, but one of the key findings, and the generation of mafia groups and local criminal actors and local militias, but one of the other key findings from our Organized Crime Index is that by far the highest scores of all the criminal actor categories that we measured in the index, the most potent vector of the illicit economy was actually state-embedded actors. Corruption and networks of protection are what most enable organized criminality. The markets that flourish are those that are somewhat state-sanctioned and enabled, and it is these that do the greatest harm to a state's resilience. So we saw an inverse relationship between a state's resilience to organized crime and the presence of state-embedded actors. When it is the state doing the crime, crime moves at record levels and often with diminishing levels of violence. What you didn't see in my West African example was a hotspot mapping exercise where it showed that actually the highest value illicit trade, which in that region is cocaine trafficking, moves with the lowest collection to local levels of violence. It is all happening along the West African littoral ports, and it goes with protection of the highest level of the state. Why? Because it's the highest value illicit economy. One thing that we noted across all of our case studies and research is the role of infrastructure. It was the opening of a tobacco-free port in the Adriatic Sea that opened the road for the Balkan route between the Balkans and Italy and the rest of Western Europe. West African coastal illicit economy hotspots were far more peaceful than inland, as I said, because they relied on the state-controlled seaports. And in the Ukraine, the closure of Odessa has displaced criminality inland, closing the outlet and disrupting both criminal and corruption markets. What do we take from the role of state-embedded actors in the shaping of the drug economy? I think actually that this is the most significant and the most important driver of where organized crime and where drug markets move. The long-term development consequences of this finding are absolutely huge and need a lot of policy weight. We have to think about how we manage a drug market in a place where the state is oriented to criminal interests. It questions whether the traditional role of technical assistance and reinforcement of state infrastructure can still be relevant, or whether it reinforces exactly the dynamics intended to solve. So there's much food for thought there, and I'm afraid it looks like not enough time to have that conversation, but I welcome discussions or questions afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Tuesday. Actually, we have one more minute, which unfortunately I can't take questions because I think we'll overrun. I think, as usual, I say my failure as a chair was the success of this session. I did some metrics. I think we had 3 people leave and 5 people come in, so the session was very successful. Can I just, 2 words of conclusion? I can't go around the globe and the concept that have been developed here, but being from the EMCDDA, for me, it's key that we have proper monitoring, proper data, relevant data and data that are of good quality and timely. We do need to look at our conceptual frameworks about markets in order to be able to capture the dynamic nature of the markets and the rapidly changing nature of the markets. We need to account for geographical and developmental differences. And last, I think we need really to have awareness and reflection of what's changing, how drivers are changing, in order to build better preparedness. Preparedness is a key word now in everything after the pandemic, but I really think it's very important when it comes to drug markets. And the usual thing in the end, which I normally forget, is to thank the speakers. But before I thank the speakers, I would like to thank you for being here with us, the audience. Without you, there's no reason to have this session. The speakers were great, thank you. And I would like to thank my colleagues for helping me prepare this session, and some of them will probably be a bit unhappy with me because I didn't give them the floor, but we can sort this out later. This session is closed. Thank you very much.